welcome to a special Friday forum. Good afternoon. I'm making clanging sounds as if on a water glass. Clang, clang. Good afternoon. Thank you to a special Friday forum. We normally don't have programs in August, as you know, but because we've had the opportunity to have such outstanding programs, we have booked two this year. Today's program is entitled An Historic Moment, the Final Recommendation of the 9/11 Commission. And our featured speaker today is former U.S. Senator Slade Gorton, who was a Washington senator and a member of the 9/11 Commission. Our program today is sponsored by the law firm of Preston Gates and Ellis LLP, and we thank them very much for making it possible for Senator Gorton to be here. And would you, incidentally, please turn off any electronic devices prior to, look, just amazing to watch people start groping when I make this announcement. I would like to say that due to the holiday, there will be no Friday forum next week, and I'm getting a lot of feedback here. Is the sound all right for the people in the back of the room? Okay, that's not good there? Okay. Okay, how is it now? Paul, I guess I'd have to keep talking in order for you to know. Well, we'll keep rolling with it. If you can't hear, make gestures. As I was saying, there is no Friday forum next September 3rd because of the holiday. But we will have a Friday forum starting our fall kickoff on September 10th, which will feature Vicki Phillips, who's our new superintendent of schools. And this will be the first chance that we have to hear her plans for the future of Portland Public Schools, something we've all been anxiously awaiting for longer than I care to remember. In addition, it's particularly appropriate, based on today's program, to mention the upcoming event entitled the September Project. This is a group of meetings to commemorate September 11th that will be led by community volunteers, and they will lead conversations on the values and ideals that define us as Americans. They'll be discussing the nature and patriotism and the role of dissent in our culture, and these events will be held at 6 venues around the city. They will be held from 10:30 until noon on September 11th, so it gives you an opportunity to engage with your fellow citizens in discussions of these very important issues. They will be followed from 3 to 5 p.m. at the Central Library with a discussion and a reading from a book called Resistance by the Oregon author Barry Lopez. And Resistance is also, coincidentally, the September book selection of our Citizens Read Book Club discussion. The September 11th project is jointly sponsored by the City Club, the Oregon Council for Humanities, and the Multnomah County Library. Further details of this can be found in your bulletin or on our website at pdxcityclub.org. Now, in addition to the great programming that we've just talked about, I'd like to mention that there's much more to come this fall with some national blockbusters and a lineup of local political debates, and we'll have our usual election year votes on ballot measures and long-term studies, and a host of other events that are designed to appeal to the broad range of members in the City Club. These activities are possible only because of the depth and breadth and leadership of City Club members, and I would like to issue an invitation to any of you today who are not members to join your fellow citizens in having a lot of fun and learning a lot about civic and being able to engage in civic activities by joining the City Club. There are membership brochures on your table, and we would certainly welcome having you as new members. Today's program is a perfect illustration of the fact that citizen engagement can make a difference. As I was just saying, this is one of the things that City Club prides itself in, learning and then becoming active in civic engagement. September 11th was a seminal moment in American history, and the comfort level of the psyche of Americans who no longer feel that their borders are safe or their military might can keep us safe. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that many Americans are still suffering from some post-traumatic stress based on the events of September 11th. Were it not for the activities of the families of some of the victims of September 11th, it is quite probable that the 9/11 Commission would not have been formed. Their extensive lobbying of our elected officials, in fact, is what created the opportunity for this bipartisan group of people to examine very closely the how and why of this event. Our speaker today is former Washington Senator Slade Gorton. He was appointed to serve on the 9/11 Commission in 2002. Senator Gorton has a long record of public service beginning in 1959 when he was elected to the Washington State House of Representatives, where he served for 10 years, with the last 2 being as Majority Leader. In 1969, he became the state's Attorney General, a post he would hold for 3 terms and during which he would argue before the Supreme Court on 14 different occasions. And baseball fans, of whom I believe there are many in Portland, will remember him as the man who saved the Mariners by suing the American League in 1979 to keep baseball in Seattle. In 1980, he was elected to the United States Senate, where he served 3 terms and was appointed to powerful posts, including appropriations, budget, and commerce. He was also a member of the Republican leadership as counsel to the Majority Leader from 1996 to 2000. After retiring from the Senate, he became of counsel to the law firm of Preston, Gates & Ellis, LLP, in 2001, and because of his distinguished record, he was asked to serve on the National Commission on Federal Elections Reform in 2001, and subsequently was asked to serve on the 9/11 Commission. We will be very interested to hear his remarks on the Commission's findings and recommendations, particularly in light of the events of the last few days, when the Senate Intelligence Committee has suggested sweeping reforms that far exceed the Commission's recommendations, and the White House recommendations, while still in a state of flux, seem to not come up to the standard that the 9/11 Commission proposed. So we're looking very much forward to hearing Senator Slade Gorton.
On September 4th, 2001, Richard Clarke, the head of the Counterterrorism Security Group in the White House during both the Clinton and early Bush administrations, sent a note to Condoleezza Rice, the head of the National Security Council, that read as follows: "Decision makers should imagine themselves on a future day when the CSG has not succeeded in stopping al-Qaeda attacks and hundreds of Americans lie dead in several countries, including the U.S. Earlier in 2001, in the first week of the Bush administration, Clarke had briefed Rice on what he called his blue sky proposal, developed in the final months of the Clinton administration and designed to roll back al-Qaeda over a period of 3 to 5 years. It was to this plan that I referred during one of our hearings earlier this year in asking Richard Clarke whether 9/11 would have been prevented had all of his recommendations been adopted immediately by the new administration. Clarke's candid and honest answer was no. This is not to criticize Richard Clarke in any respect whatsoever. He was the most aggressive and the most alarmist White House aide on counterterrorism in both administrations. He was also the highest-ranking official in the White House in both, whose exclusive assignment was counterterrorism. And yet, even Richard Clarke's imagination did not encompass an attack on the United States more serious than those on our African embassies in 1998. And even he was content with a 3 to 5 year program to roll back al-Qaeda. And so, obviously, with all of the clarity of 20/20 hindsight, the first failure that we of the 9/11 Commission attribute to our defenders is a failure of imagination. No one inside our government imagined an attack of this immensity, so no one prepared for it. Neither candidate for president in 2000 discussed Islamist terrorism in his campaign. A year earlier, Vice President Gore chaired a prestigious commission on aircraft security. Its report did not mention the possibility of suicidal hijackers. The Senate committee that I chaired at the time asked the Vice President no questions on the subject. As recently as 1999, the New York Times questioned claims that Osama bin Laden was in fact a terrorist leader. And so our protective agencies failed. Now, at the heart of that failure, inside our government, in my view, was the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA had a no-fly list. That no-fly list had 18 names on it of people not permitted on airplanes in the United States. The FAA's security people first heard of a State Department list of several thousand suspected terrorists at one of our hearings earlier this year. The FAA's protocol for hijackings was based on those that took place in the 1970s. It was to cooperate with the hijackers and to take them wherever they wished to go. Its security directives were aimed almost solely at preventing explosives on airplanes and were thus aimed at checked baggage. 4-inch knives, for example, were permissible carry-ons. But perhaps the most striking and systematic breakdown in the FAA was that is illustrated by the events of 9/11 itself. The Air Force was notified of the hijacking of American Flight 11, the first flight to be hijacked, less than 9 minutes before it crashed into World Trade Center Tower number 1. United Flight 175 impacted with World Trade Center Tower number 2 before the Air Force was notified that the aircraft had been hijacked. The Air Force was notified of the hijacking of American Flight 77 at exactly the moment that it hit the Pentagon. And finally, the FAA notified the Air Force of the hijacking of United Flight 93 4 minutes after its heroic passengers caused it to crash into a field in Pennsylvania, rather than proceeding almost certainly to hit the capital of the United States. But the Air Force, through NORAD, was also unprepared. It looked outward only at threats from overseas and never contemplated the possibility of domestic hijackings. With the end of the Cold War, it had only 4 ready fighters available at 2 bases in the entire eastern United States. And the President's authorization to shoot down threatening aircraft only reached the Air Force well after the last impact, and reached the 2 scrambled jets that were then over Washington, D.C., not at all. Only 2 Maryland Air National Guard fighters had such orders, which were received outside of the normal chain of military command. The CIA. The CIA never developed intelligence precise enough to encourage either President Clinton or President Bush to order decisive action to be taken against Al-Qaeda. The FBI. The FBI provided little counter-terrorism intelligence to the White House at all. In fact, FBI Director Louis Freeh never met once with President Clinton during his entire 2 terms, nor did he provide significant information to President Bush. FBI intelligence got to the White House indirectly through the CIA. For example, the CIA told President Bush in its now famous August 6, 2001 presidential daily briefing that the FBI was engaged in 70 full field investigations on terrorism, perhaps a comforting assurance to a president. In fact, the largest single number of those investigations were financial only. 8 others had been closed. 4 involved people in custody or in jail, and 1 a suspect who was dead. And every investigation of 2 people counted as 2 investigations. The FBI, prior to 9/11, regarded terrorism as primarily a law enforcement challenge. It pursued terrorists after the fact, seeking to build cases that could be successfully prosecuted in court. And so, after these spectacular failures, 19 individuals with a total budget of less than $500,000 stymied every defense of the United States against terrorism and inflicted on us the most costly surprise attack in our history. Thereafter, we reacted decisively, both in Afghanistan and in the United States. Congress and the President joined in ordering dramatic changes. Those changes have made us safer, but not safe. A joint committee of the intelligence committees of the House and Senate studied the 9/11 attacks through most of the year 2002, with a deadline at the end of that year as that Congress adjourned, and because of the demands of victims' families organizations, it ordered an outside investigation by law with the reluctant consent of the President. Now, I can say as a member, it would be difficult to design a more partisan birth for a group of people tasked with writing a thorough and objective history of a national tragedy and with making constructive recommendations based on its lessons. One member of the 9/11 Commission, the chairman, was chosen by the President. The other 9 by the 4 leaders of the 2 parties in each House of Congress. And yet we completed our task 20 months later, surprising not only the country, but I may say ourselves, by our total unanimity down to the final footnote. We were fortunate. At first, the President named Henry Kissinger as the chairman, and Senator Daschle tabbed George Mitchell, a former Senate Majority Leader, as vice chairman. It would have been difficult to find 2 more partisan leaders anywhere in the country. Fortunately, both resigned promptly when they learned of the business disclosures required of all commission appointees. They were succeeded by their polar opposites. Tom Kean, president of a small private university, was a 2-term governor of New Jersey. Lee Hamilton, a former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, now runs the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. 2 less partisan partisans could nowhere have been found. They seemed to have agreed early on never to disagree. I gave them the nickname the Twins. And as a result of their leadership, there was not a single partisan vote taken during the entire history of the commission, and very, very few votes of any nature. Partly at my suggestion, Kane and Hamilton chose Philip Zelikow, a University of Virginia academic who heads its think tank, the Miller Center, as staff director. He, in turn, chose a staff of almost 80 men and women with background careers in the CIA, the FBI, U.S. prosecuting attorneys' offices, and academia. Altogether, a superlatively qualified and hard-working group. With access to 3 million pages of documents, and after interviewing 1,200 witnesses, 160 of them in public hearings, the staff produced a draft report that members read and critiqued line by line between 4 and 7 times. The bulk of the final report is a factual, dispassionate, and complete history of the relevant events and decisions that led to the catastrophe on 9/11. That history is followed by a series of recommendations, the power and authority of which grow not out of abstract thought, but out of the history itself. First, however, in order to determine the nature of our response, it was necessary to define the nature of the struggle in which we find ourselves today and the nature and driving force of the enemy. Like Hitler in Mein Kampf, Osama bin Laden has told us explicitly what he intends and what his goals are. When asked what Americans could do in order to end his attacks on us, he tells us, abandon the Middle East, convert to Islam, and end the immorality and godlessness of our society and culture. He summarized it in these words: it is sad to tell you that you are the worst civilization in the history of mankind. This ideology, we determined, did not originate with Osama bin Laden. It draws on a long tradition of extreme intolerance within one stream of Islam, albeit very much a minority one. That tradition does not distinguish between politics and religion, thus distorting both. Its appeal is enhanced by resentments stemming from 3 centuries of uninterrupted decline in Muslim societies as against the West, a decline not likely to be reversed as long as so much of Islam so severely discriminates against women. But these resentments attract at least the sympathies of millions of Muslims who do not support terrorism as a tactic. We cannot bargain or negotiate with that ideology. It can only be eliminated or totally isolated. At the same time, we must surmount the extraordinarily difficult challenge of separating the extremists from a peaceful Muslim majority, at least in part by carrying a message of hope against fear, of life against death, all with the understanding that for the survival of these societies, they must come first from within and can only be encouraged from without. And so finally, the 9/11 Commission offers a global strategy in 2 parts: what to do and how to do it. There are 3 pillars in our recommendations about what to do. First, attack terrorists, their organizations, and their sanctuaries. Second, prevent the continued growth of Islamist terrorism, largely through a systematic war of ideas and carefully focused aid. And third, protect against and prepare for terrorist attacks with stronger border controls, carefully directed state and local assistance, and appropriate law enforcement tools, all with a careful attention to the protection of our civil liberties. With respect to how to do it, the current debate across the country, we call for unity of effort across the foreign-domestic intelligence divide, historically separated into domestic and foreign, into the FBI and the CIA. The President did well, we found, in creating a terrorist threat integration center called TTIC, but it is staffed by mid-level and lower-level personnel borrowed from the CIA, the FBI, and the Department of Defense, all of whom will return to their original agencies and thus lack the authority to require the absolutely vital intelligence sharing, the absence of which so tragically contributed to 9/11. We want TTIC to be exalted into a national counterterrorism center, headed by a presidential appointee with the authority to demand cooperation among agencies and to task those agencies to look for missing links when the center finds a need to do so. Next, we need unity of effort in the intelligence community by the creation of a national intelligence director appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. That officer should have authority the CI director has never had to coordinate all of the intelligence activities of 15 different federal agencies, but he can have that only if that officer is given control over the intelligence budget and considerable influence over the appointment of directors of the action agencies. Power the CIA director lacks. Those budget and personnel powers are not only necessary, but are perhaps the most controversial of all of our recommendations, a set of recommendations the President has yet to accept. Congress has responded to our report promptly and enthusiastically. I may say that after 18 years in Washington, D.C., I've never seen so many members spending their August in that city rather than at home. But with one minor exception, only insofar as they apply to executive agencies. Earlier this week, Senator Roberts, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, has not only recommended adopting all of our proposals, but a breakup of the CIA itself, which has had at least the salutary effect of making our proposals look more modest than they originally were. With that one exception, Congress has been silent with respect to our equally important suggestions for congressional reform. Earlier this week in the Senate, a small group was appointed at least to study the problem. But even the most optimistic of us are not holding our breaths until its adoption. Today, for example, the Secretary of Homeland Security reports to 88 congressional committees and subcommittees, and intelligence agencies to dozens more. Consolidation is urgently needed, both so that one committee can exercise authority over both operations and budget, and so that the agencies themselves can concentrate on their vital tasks. The FBI, interestingly enough, as poorly as it performed before 9/11, has done a first-rate job of reform under Director Bob Mueller, who took over the FBI just 1 week before 9/11. Thus without any investment in the past. Mueller now offers a bureau careerist as promising a career in intelligence and in counterterrorism as in law enforcement. He trains all new agents in both disciplines. We recommend that his reforms be strengthened and institutionalized so that there can be no backsliding later. In summary, we live in highly partisan times. The 9/11 Commission was created in a highly partisan fashion. We were able, however, to transcend that creation and to reach an agreed nonpartisan conclusion. Nevertheless, the status quo has and is a powerful lobby, perhaps the most powerful in Washington, D.C. As a consequence, few opportunities have arisen in our political history for dramatic change. But this is one of those opportunities. 9/11 altered not only our history, but our attitudes. We've done well since 9/11 in preventing attacks here in the United States and in disrupting terrorists abroad. But we are in a war that will be measured not in years, but in decades. And we have fallen far short of all we need to do to protect our land, our people, and our liberties. That is a task for every one of us. Thank you.
I'll tell them how they're supposed to behave. Well, now we come to the part where City Club members only have the privilege of asking questions of our speaker. And I would like to remind those members who would like to ask a question that questions are supposed to be phrased as a question, not as a statement, and should be delivered within 30 seconds or less out of respect for both the speaker and the audience. Our first question today will be asked by our board host, Nikki Lynch. She's a senior financial planner and vice president at Merrill Lynch. She's been a member of City Club for over 20 years, has chaired the research board, and is currently chairing the program committee. Nikki?
Well, I guess I come to this question sort of looking back, and I'm sort of a Pollyanna and a naive person, but one of the things you said was to attack was a solution, and I guess I questioned attacking Afghanistan as a solution and questioned more attacking Iraq, and maybe you could explain how effective, in what ways that has been effective in calming terrorism as opposed to stirring up more terrorism and hatred against our country.
Now, we were unanimous on the fact that one, in a struggle like this, that a country cannot act solely on the defensive. And perhaps the best illustration of the fact is that that's what we did do. From the original declaration of war of Osama bin Laden in the earlier mid-1960s, until 2001. There was only, one response, a very weak single one after the embassy bombings in East Africa. These were signals, of course, to the people who sought to do us harm. I think, I believe the other members of the commission think that perhaps an even more striking examination of the example of that, as well as an illustration of the American political system, was the bombing of the Cole in Aden. One would think that Al-Qaeda might have been smart enough to figure that a good time to attack was right before an election, but we don't give them that much credit. We now know, we didn't know then, that there was an attempt to sink one of our warships in Aden in January of the year 2000 that failed so utterly, the boat that was going to do it sank, that we didn't even know about it at the time. So the late October attack on the Cole was timed fortuitously for them. The Clinton administration, through the CIA and the Clinton administration, determined within a week or 10 days that almost certainly that was an Al-Qaeda attack. They could not answer the White House questions as to whether or not bin Laden had ordered it. And given the fact the election was over by that time, President Clinton was the lame duck, there was a contest over the election going on, the Clinton administration elected to do nothing. The Bush administration came into power. By the time it had even organized its offices, it was March of 2001. The Bush administration had told us it wanted a more systematic approach to this problem. The coal happened on someone else's watch and was stale, and so nothing was done. Now, both of those decisions are very logical within the frame of reference of our thinking in a country like this. But almost the only impact they could have had on Osama bin Laden was to tell him once again, it's free. Nothing's going to happen. You can do whatever you want. He fled right after the coal. Nothing happened. He fled right after the embassy bombings. There was, one attack on basically on some sand, with missiles. But the message that we gave was that terrorism was relatively free. And that lack of action contributed hugely to 9/11. And so the basic answer to one's question, if one only wants to become a fortress state and try to protect everything in the United States, something that is impossible, you're simply going to have to go over this out after this particular philosophy, and to be very blunt, kill them before they kill you. It's just as simple as that. I think the 9/11 Commission all agrees that the action in Afghanistan has contributed hugely to American safety. We were not the Iraq Commission. We were to deal with 9/11. We probably would have split had we had to deal with Iraq. But in Philadelphia last night, one of my Democratic colleagues, Bob Kerry, was very strong on Iraq as being a contribution to the war against terror. The one conclusion we do come to in connection with Iraq is that the United States can't possibly afford to allow Iraq to become a sanctuary area for future terrorists. In connection with Al-Qaeda, we haven't succeeded in eliminating it by any means, but it no longer has the luxury and ability to plan and to train at leisure in an area in which it is, for all practical purposes, fully protected. We've been both fortunate, and I think a lot of this has to do with our own preparations, in seeing to it that there have been no more terrorist attacks in the United States for almost 3 years, though another one could come tomorrow. But we're perfectly well aware that large numbers of them have taken places in other parts of the world, in areas which seem to be bluntly softer targets, and that philosophy is still alive and well, and that one element of it is to go after it before it comes after us. Now, shall I just take the questions? All right, we'll just go back and forth between the two microphones.
Paul Milius, City Club member. One of the hallmarks of any bureaucracy, be it civil or governmental, is that people tend to give the boss what he wants to hear. How much, and in some ways it always seemed to me that the American intelligence establishment has become, to one degree or another, politicized. When the boss wants to hear something, they step up and provide the information in one way or the other. How much of politicizing or it has been involved in the failures in 9/11?
That's an interesting concept, and I think very widely held. I don't think it accords with our findings. Rather than to say the intelligence agencies became politicized, I think we would say that they became overly bureaucratized. Our reading, I think if you read our book here, I don't think either President Clinton or President Bush were being given what they wanted to hear. In fact, I think both of them ended up being frustrated that they never got an intelligence report that really gave them confidence in giving a particular order of how to deal with the challenge that they could have confidence in. You see an awful lot of finger pointing between the Department of Defense and the CIA, particularly during the Clinton administration. You see the tragic, I think, results of a debate over the Predator, the unmanned aircraft, between the CIA and the Department of Defense. it may have been delayed in its operations for as much as 6 months by an argument over $5 million. Who was going to be responsible for $5 million if one of them got shot down? It's one of the reasons that we recommended consolidating all, military activities, covert as well as overt, in the Department of Defense rather than splitting them between the two agencies. So there isn't much evidence that presidents were being told what they wanted to hear. They weren't being told very much at all that was of any value to them in making decisions. Now, that doesn't mean to say there weren't really good people down in the ranks. For example, I was hugely critical of the FAA, but the FAA controllers, for example, in Boston, were extremely resourceful. I said they only got 9 minutes notice of one and none of the rest. If they'd followed protocol, they'd still be making their calls. They were supposed to go up about 5 levels in the FAA and then down about 5 levels in the Department of Defense. Those controllers were resourceful enough so that when they decided that this was a hijacking, they called the Air Force. Now, unfortunately, with the stovepiping, the first Air Force base they called had been closed for 4 years. But they did call directly to the Air Force to get, to get something started. And that was true in a number of other areas, and it's true with some of the people in the intelligence departments, but they were so closed on their intelligence, so not wanting to tell it to anybody else, that the FBI didn't know what the CIA was doing, the CIA didn't know what the FBI was doing, the Defense Department groups were off doing something else. And the reason, we don't think a structural change is magic by any means, because it's going to be human beings that are going to be carrying these things. But we think there ought to be someone in or very close to the White House who's mandated to get all of the information about whatever the challenge is that exists anywhere in these 15 other agencies, and to be able to go to the White House with it. We do not want to give intelligence agencies policy. They don't make. They should not make decisions about what to do about it. That should be the President and the National Security Council. But it is clear in this case, presidents weren't getting information on which they could act.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. Let me first add one more voice of praise for the work of the Commission, not only for its bipartisanship, but also the care and thoroughness with which it did its work. My question focuses on the fact that most of the hijackers on 9/11 were citizens of Saudi Arabia. Did the Commission reach any conclusion about how our foreign policy in relation to Saudi Arabia should be reshaped as a result of that fact?
We have, I guess if we divided up our recommendations, they fall into roughly into 3 categories. One are the very precise recommendations to the Congress as to how we should organize our own government. Another set are a little bit more general and are directed at the executive itself, how it ought to carry out its own responsibilities. And the third, which include foreign policy that I spoke to, are, I guess if I could properly describe them, are somewhat softer, because they have to be more, they have to be more generalized, and they have to do with decisions that other people basically have to make, in other countries that we can only influence. In that connection, we have sections on Saudi Arabia, on Afghanistan, and on Pakistan. And Saudi Arabia is well, in one sense, they're all unique cases, but this is particularly true with respect to Saudi Arabia. We have, for various domestic reasons alike, we have a huge dependence on Saudi Arabia, with respect to petroleum. It is the most religiously fundamentalist of all of the Islamic states, the one that most systematically discriminates against women. It is certainly not democratic in any respect whatsoever. It, even before 9/11, was a nominal ally of the United States in a number of ways. We had troops stationed there to a certain extent, to protect Saudi Arabia itself. And so it was a peculiar situation. You're right, 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudis who had grown up in that extremist religious tradition or had taken it on as relatively young men. Huge amounts of money are still being spent in the United States here, by Saudis in propagating that form of Wahhabism. Even after 9/11, we didn't get the kind of cooperation from Saudi Arabia that we wished. Ironically, we are now. Why? Because Saudi Arabia has become a target. And I think it's certainly appropriate to say that as long as they figured they could export this kind of idea, they were fairly comfortable with it. Now the regime itself is threatened by it itself, and it is far more cooperative with the United States than it's ever been before. But these questions they're extremely difficult questions. One, as an individual member, as a senator, I always thought we were too soft on Saudi Arabia. It didn't matter whether it was a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. The policy didn't change one way or another. But there were always these other domestic imperatives that caused us to do so. If I can take another example as to how hard these questions are to answer, and they are difficult to answer, it would be Pakistan, and we read about Pakistan here. During the Clinton administration, Afghanistan was truly a sanctuary because there was no way for us to get to it. There was no country bordering on it that had any use for us, that would help us out at all. You could shoot off rockets, missiles, but that's about all that one could do. One of our most colorful witnesses was Richard Armitage, who's the Deputy Secretary of State, kind of wonderful way with language. And he told us that in March or April of 2001, he thought it time to see if we couldn't repair our relations with Pakistan, greatly frustrated by Congress because we had imposed all kinds of sanctions on Pakistan. Probably the most dramatic is the fact that years ago, a decade or more ago, they bought a dozen or 20 F-18s from us. We took their money, manufactured the planes, and wouldn't give them to them, and wouldn't give them their money back. Not calculated to create a friendly relationship by any means. So in any event, Armitage goes over to Islamabad and says, we'd like to repair relations. And the Pakistanis' response was, well, yeah, you thought we were great and you provided us a lot of help while the Soviets were in Afghanistan, but once they were gone, you just tossed us aside like trash. And all you've done is sanction us ever since. As Armitage put it, they said, well, Mr. Armitage, if we come over on your side again, are you going to treat us like a Dixie cup? And they didn't change until after 9/11, when in 48 hours, as a result of an ultimatum, they did so because the implicit threat was that if you remain recalcitrant, we're going to tilt heavily on India's side in your most important challenge. But now we have a situation in which to deal with this terrorism in Afghanistan and in Pakistan itself, we have to have a high degree of cooperation from Pakistan. The Pakistani president took office by a military coup. They don't have elections, or they don't have real elections there to a considerable extent. We would like people to be free and have elections, but there's a very real risk in countries like this of a riff off an old slogan. In this case, one man, one vote, one time. What if you have an election and you elect people who don't want elections anymore, which is a real possibility. So the United States has this tremendous challenge. How far do you push pluralism and elections and democracy? And how much do you say, this guy is on our side and a tremendous challenge to us, and we've got to provide him with a degree of support? We talk about that. We talk about it in the soft way. That's the answer to your question. The problem is these questions are hard to answer because there's so many legitimately competing considerations.
Ted Raphael, new member today. My question relates to your second pillar, which is, if I may characterize it as winning the hearts and minds through a debate of ideas and focused aid. In a recent book published anonymously by a CIA Middle East senior analyst, he would disagree with that. I want to get your reaction. Because in none of the three pillars is foreign policy mentioned. It's a follow-up to the previous question.
Sure.
Would a change, the umbrella question is, would a change in U.S. foreign policy make a difference? Is that the crux of the problem? Let me follow up by saying, both in terms of support for corrupt regimes and so-called corrupt regimes in the Middle East, and U.S. policies towards Israel, particularly the recent reversal of the president's position on settlements.
Well, let me say first, Anonymous is not anonymous to us. We know who it is. He's one of the people we interviewed on several occasions. He is a very good CIA officer who was frustrated, by some of the elements that were part of my answer to the first question. A guy down in the ranks who saw very clearly what we ought to do, but we never did it, because of some of these other considerations. And it's easy to reach, the conclusions that he has. It was not our conclusion, and I will, go back to what I said about Osama bin Laden, that say a change in our attitude toward Israel is going to result in any significant change in this form of terrorism. I've told you what he wants. One of the things he's used from time to time is leave Saudi Arabia. Well, we've left Saudi Arabia. It hasn't had any effect. I'm convinced personally we could allow another Holocaust, kill every Jew in Israel. And the societal attitudes on terrorism would remain roughly as it is today. I don't think that we can have a successful foreign policy that is, in fact I'm sure of it, that is based on trying to placate the people who declare themselves to be at war, not only with us, but with all of Western civilization. But our second point is not so much a change in our foreign policy as a change in the example we set and in a far more systematic encouragement of those very significant groups of people in those countries who really want what we want, who would like to live in a secure and in a democratic society, would like to be able to provide education for their kids, and in connection with my on Pakistan. Pakistan hardly provides a public education system, so it's these madrasas, these extreme places that run by the churches that provide education. Well, I think we can profitably help many of those countries provide a secular education system. Now, is that going to change minds next year or even 5 years from now? These are, these are long-term views, because these are long-term grievances and ideas, and most of the impetus for change is going to have to come internally. We can simply encourage it, but we ought to do everything we can. We don't spend nearly enough money even putting out our own words in radio and television broadcasts, for example. We spend a pittance on even setting out the ability to see what we're for, or to get our attitudes across. Okay, it's this side.
Hi, my name is Jacob Rose. I am a new junior member tonight. And my question to you is, why has the commission not investigated the likelihood that the towers were destroyed by a controlled demolition, whereas the towers could not have been destroyed by the fire that was generated from the planes? Okay. Okay. Why haven't the commission investigated the likelihood that the World Trade Center was destroyed by a controlled demolition, whereas the building was collapsed from the bottom to the top as in a controlled demolition, and whereas the plane that hit the building was not hot enough to melt the steel frame that held the World Trade Center together? Thank you.
Well, the answer to that question is we didn't go into that because it's not true. The planes were hit and the towers were hit and destroyed, as was the Pentagon, by hijacked aircraft. So we,
Any more?
you know, we began with what happened, and then we tried to figure out why and how.
My name is Arnold Kogan, member of the City Club. Thank you, Senator, for being with us today and sharing your comments. I'd like to return to the first question that came from Nikki Lynch about Iraq. Part of the justification for invading Iraq was that we should go after the terrorists over there before they come after us over here. Could you clarify the Commission's findings about that specific Iraqi-sponsored terrorism in general, and any linkage between that terrorism and the 9/11 tragedy itself?
No, you know, I've got to answer that question as a commission member very narrowly. We were the 9/11 Commission, not the Iraq Commission. We did not study in any respect, with save one, Iraqi sponsorship of terrorism. The one area was Iraq involved in the 9/11 plot itself? And there we found that while there were frequent relationships between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, that they did not amount to any cooperation in the 9/11 attacks themselves.
Thank you.
Aubrey Russell, City Club member. A few weeks ago, maybe even months now, there was testimony on the Hill in front of a committee in which one of your commission staff members was reading from a staff statement. And what surprised me was the frequency, actually, with which Ariel Sharon and Israel was mentioned, and the context was Osama bin Laden and planning for the attacks, and he apparently delegated most of the responsibility, but he attempted to intervene in order to change the timing of the attacks to correspond with military and political actions that were occurring in Israel. And so in trying to sort of look at your three pillars and the war of ideas, not looking forward so much, but looking back, how large was American support of Israel, do you think, in motivating some of the Arab and Muslim frustrations with U.S. policy and targeting of the U.S. for those particular attacks?
Osama bin Laden uses that, among other things, at the same level that he used a criticism of the fact that there were any American troops in Saudi Arabia itself. But his fundamental philosophy is much deeper than that, and is much more widely simply anti-Western and anti our religion, or I think more specifically in his criticism, what he considers to be the absolute absence of religion in the United States. Are there people in that world whose primary concern is Israel? Of course there are. There are people whose primary concern is changing the nature of Saudi Arabia and the terrorism which may very well have caused the two Russian crashes a couple of days ago has to do with Chechnya, almost certainly. Russians don't tell us really what happened or even what they know about things anymore. So there are various motivations on the parts of various groups. I believe it's safe to say, however, that the Al-Qaeda opposition to the United States, while it includes all of those things, is much broader than any one or two or three of them. See, who's next? It's your turn.
Brooks, City Club member. I hope this isn't too similar to some previous questions, but in the recommendations that I've sort of scanned, I see offensive strategies, defensive strategies, and tactical strategies as far as reorganization, but not a lot on State Department diplomatic efforts. And I guess my question is, do you think the next president should treat that as a priority strategy?
I'm not sure I would characterize this as saying that diplomacy doesn't have a great deal to do with this, because of course it does in that whole second field when we talk about three things. One, going after terrorists in their sanctuaries, and the third one is preparing against attacks here. And the middle of those, of course, has to do, with foreign policy and our attitudes elsewhere. And that is a and that's to a certain, very considerable degree, a State Department function. And yes, it was important in the past. It didn't succeed. It didn't help. We kept thinking, and this was true not only in the Clinton administration, but the first step in Richard Clark's 3 to 5 year policy was once again talk to the Taliban and see whether or not they'll give up Osama bin Laden. It was a strict foreign policy thing. We did persuade the Saudis to go to Afghanistan and speak on our behalf in that connection. And that was the first thing that the Bush administration was going to do as well. Well, we learned afterwards the Taliban allowed itself to be destroyed, rather than to give up the people for whom it was providing a sanctuary. So the answer is yes, foreign policy, especially of a soft, non-threatening nature like that, is important, but it obviously doesn't work in every case or in many cases. So the whole idea is to have a balanced approach. We can't possibly just be purely defensive and say we're going to have strong passive defenses against terrorism. We've got to have much better intelligence about what people are planning to do so that we can interrupt individual plots. And we are all, 10 of us, convinced we've got to go after these people who are totally irreconcilable where they are. But diplomacy ought to be able to see to it that there are no sanctuaries in places where there might otherwise be. You don't have to go necessarily every time into war or into a military action to deny sanctuaries. You try to persuade the people who are at least nominally in charge of those sanctuary areas to close them down themselves, and that's obviously the best way to do it if you can.
The senators graciously agreed to speak a little longer, so we're already over by a couple of minutes. This will be our last question, but if anyone has to leave, this will be our last question.
Okay. My question has to do with international cooperation. I rather like the recommendation you have about an International Youth Opportunity Fund, but in the area of intelligence gathering and analysis, does the Commission report speak to that question of cooperation with other nations versus go it alone?
Question has to do with international cooperation with respect to intelligence. And it is interesting that our relationships with other countries exist on many levels. By and large, we're fairly pleased with that cooperation we get from intelligence agencies, even from Western European countries with which we don't agree, on many other things. Sometimes the problem of that intelligence sharing is typified by Pakistan. We still have a very real feeling that if we share any intelligence in Pakistan, or if we ask a question in Pakistan, it gets to our enemies that we've done so. That there are a lot of sympathizers with the other side in their intelligence agencies, and we think that that's probably true in Saudi Arabia as well, and in a number of other places. Because intelligence sharing is not a one-way street by any means. People cooperate with you if you're cooperating with them. But with that very significant caveat, we are by and large pleased with the degree of cooperation we get from major intelligence agencies in other parts of the world. Thank you all very much for inviting me.
I want to thank Senator Gorton very much and thank Preston, Gates, and Ellis for giving us the opportunity to hear him today. We're waiting with bated breath to see how the 9/11 Commission's recommendations are played out. We're adjourned. See you on the 10th.